I'll admit it. I used to be one of those people who found classics extremely boring and would only read them if I was forced to in the context of school. In the past few years, I have discovered so many classic novels or classic works of nonfiction that are actually really interesting and like really worth reading. So let's pretend that I am a professor and you are all attending my Hot Girl Literature 101 course. I think I might make this a little series on my channel where I talk about books that every hot girl should read. And of course, we have to start with the classics, the foundation of hot girl literature. So if I were the professor of Hot Girl Literature 101, these are the classic novels that I would make you read. And I'd like to quickly say you've probably seen my new glasses in a few of my videos. And I want to say thank you so much to Pair for sponsoring today's video. If you haven't heard of them, Pair is an eyewear brand that's committed to affordability, which is something that a lot of people struggle with when looking for glasses. And one of the ways that they do this is by allowing you to switch up your look in seconds. So the model that I got is called the Quinn, and I got the clear base frames, but you can also add top frames that snap on magnetically like this, so I could go for black. Or I also got tortoise because I love wearing brown, so I thought this would go with like a cute brown look. I also got sunglasses. At first I wasn't super sure about like ordering glasses online, but the process was super easy. You can do a virtual try on that's actually surprisingly really accurate. And if you're curious about getting your first pair, you can use my code MILLA15 for 15% off your first order. We're gonna start at the classics. And when I say classics, I mean classics, like classical antiquity. I think that every hot girl should be well read and well versed in at least one work from classical antiquity, if not more. The ones that I can recommend are of course the works of Homer. This feels so unserious. So either the Odyssey or the Iliad. This one tells the story of the Trojan War, and if that's not ringing a bell, maybe this book will. This is a retelling of the Iliad. And then this is the telling of Odysseus returning home, like the 20 years that it takes him to get home or something. Not really sure, I'm a bit rusty on this one, but I think everyone should read either one of those books. And if that doesn't float your boat, maybe something a little shorter. Oedipus the King by Sophocles. Oedipus. This is also good if you're interested in like Freud, or if you're interested in like hating on Freud, because this is where his whole Oedipal complex comes from. And it's actually a really good read. It's not at all what you expect. I would definitely recommend. It's also like tiny. It took me like 45 minutes to read for a class. And if you're interested in poetry, I don't have it on me because I read it in the course pack of my Intro to College English class in my first semester. I would also definitely recommend Ovid's Metamorphoses. I think that's what it is. Those are where you'll find a lot of the myths, like of Pygmalion and Galatea and Persephone and Hades, and like all those myths. They're beautifully written in poetry, and I definitely recommend for like a little foundation in the literature of antiquity. Moving forward several thousand years, I would also definitely recommend reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. I feel like a lot of us were forced to read this in high school. I was forced to read it in high school, and I hated it the first time I read it. I'll fully admit it. But then I had to read it again in my first semester of college, and I loved it the second time around. I think my teacher really explained it way better. And I'm the kind of person who loves to be explained a book in class because it makes me appreciate it so much more. It's set in Victorian London, and it's about this young, handsome socialite, I'm gonna call him a socialite, called Dorian Gray, who is basically manipulated by this older gentleman, Lord Henry. A painter paints a portrait of him at the beginning of the novel, and, well, you'll see the rest, but it's really honestly worth reading. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of social commentary, and I think everybody should read The Picture of Dorian Gray. Yet another book, or I hesitate to even call this book, it's more of a novella, that I first read in my Intro to College English class. As you can see, that class had a major effect on me as a person. That book would be The Metamorphoses by Franz Kafka. That was also in the course pack of my Intro to College English class, so I don't have like an actual copy of it. I think this is also such a short read that like you might as well just read it It's so short, it'll take you like an hour to read maybe. And I also think it has such a big impact on like our society. There's so many like references to it, and a lot of the time I like to read classics so I can understand the references that people make to them. So The Metamorphosis is basically about this man called Gregor Samsa who one day awakens as a bug. Who wouldn't want to read that? That one also has a lot of social commentary imbued in it, and it's very much the kind of book that made me understand like metaphors in general, just in general, made me understand metaphors as more than what we learned them in high school, which was very like surface level. It made me understand how a metaphor can really span the entire length of a novel or a novella in this case. It's definitely a little weird, a little disturbing, and it's 100% worth the read. The next book I'm sure most of you have read in high school, but it's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I also think this book has had just such a huge impact on like pop culture and like contemporary Western society. It's set in the 1920s in New York, and it's basically told through the eyes of Nick, who's the unreliable narrator, and he talks about his neighbor, Jay Gatsby, who he's like kind of obsessed with. And it's basically the story of Gatsby, Nick, and then another couple, the Buchanans, so Daisy and Tom. And it's the story of Gatsby and Daisy's very ill-fated star-crossed love story. I'm not trying to say that this is like the best book ever or anything, but I think it's worth reading just to like say that you've read it and again understand like all these references that pop culture makes to it. I'm really interested in reading other of F. Scott Fitzgerald's works, like Tender is the Night, The Beautiful and the Damned, but so far this is the only one I've read. I read it twice. I read it once like for pleasure, and then later for my last year of high school we read it, and I really liked it both times. The next book I don't have a copy of because I borrowed it from my school's library, but it's Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This book I read recently. I read it in February and I really loved it. At first I found it a little hard to get into just because it's mostly written in Southern dialect, but it's set in the 1930s in the South, and it's the story of this woman, Janie, and kind of just like her entire life. Janie is such an interesting character, and I found the love story of her and Tea Cake really, really fascinating. I think Zora Neale Hurston does an amazing job of like foreshadowing events that will come in the future and giving you only bits and pieces, so you have to read the whole novel to really understand. It's another really, really thin read, and I just found it so beautiful and so tragic. I really loved it, and I would highly recommend reading this book. The next book that I have, I also don't have because I lent it to my mom, and I don't know where it is. Anyways, it's Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is set in the 40s or 50s in Paris. I have to say it's either the only or one of the only classic novels that I've actually felt like an emotional attachment to. Like, it genuinely broke my heart. It's so tragic, but it's basically about this American expat living in Paris, and he starts an affair with this Italian bartender called Giovanni. You just get so much of the protagonist's like pain. He's such a tortured soul, and you just watch him make all the wrong decisions. It's so sad, but so good and so beautiful. I also think it's super interesting to see how Baldwin could write such like an explicit love story between two men in like the mid 20th century. And it's so interesting to see like these like queer stories discussed with such like frankness. I don't know. I think it's beautiful and it's really, really worth reading. And if you're like me, you'll honestly get so emotionally invested in it. And it was quite sad. It was quite heartbreaking. Ugh. It's one of those books where you just read it and you're like, why are you doing this? But also you understand. The next book is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And if you haven't heard of The Bell Jar, maybe you've seen the whole fig tree analogy thing on TikTok recently. Well, it comes from this book. The Bell Jar, I think, is like very much a hot girl 101 book. It's a book that many girls base their whole personalities off of. It's basically this really disturbing and like almost like nauseating, in my opinion, story of this young woman who she starts the novel working like a fashion magazine internship in New York. It's set in the 50s. It's just about her not really knowing what to do with her life. And I think a lot of the parts, especially the fig tree analogy, of course, are very relatable. It's not an easy read, it's not a feel-good read, and a lot of it is very like autobiographical, and Sylvia Plath did end up committing suicide very famously. But I would definitely recommend it. I think it's another one of those books that you need to read just to like understand it and understand our society's reaction to it. I have a little trifecta of books for the next read. These are all from the 70s, specifically 1970s LA. The first one I recommend is of course The White Album by Joan Didion. This is one of the only works of nonfiction on this list, and it's basically a collection of essays by Joan Didion, who's an incredibly talented writer. It's about the 1960s in LA. It's about all the social, cultural, and political changes that were occurring at the time. However, I also will fully admit that this book is not for everybody. And a lot of the stuff is like lost on us as modern readers just because we didn't grow up at that time. I still 100% recommend it. I think it's incredible. I really enjoyed reading it. But if you want something similar, I could recommend Slow Days, Fast Company, The World, the Flesh, and LA by Eve Babbitt's. This is also set in the 60s and 70s. It's also a collection of personal essays. These ones are more personal to Eve Babbitt's, the author, who was such an important member of like the LA scene in the 60s and 70s. I also definitely recommend this book. It's super interesting, very funny to see her observations of like American society in general. But if you're a fiction girl like me, even though I'm trying to get more into nonfiction, I can also recommend Sex and Rage, also by Eve Babbitt's. This is definitely semi-autobiographical. A lot of the content of the book is based on Babbitt's own life, but it is a work of fiction. It's also set in 1970s LA and New York, and it's about this author, Jacaranda. It's very much a book that doesn't really follow a specific plot lines. This is the kind of book that I would read 100% just for the quality of the writing itself. It's such a dreamy book. There's not really a lot going on plot-wise, but it's still amazing. I think it's such a good coming-of-age story, and I would highly recommend. I would say this is definitely like a good like beach read. The last book on my list was only published about 30 years ago, but I would definitely call it a modern classic. It's The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I'm sure a lot of you have also read. I'm calling it a modern classic just because I feel like it's already had such a huge impact on like literature and like pop culture. My camera's dying, so that's why I know I need to wrap it up. I've read this book twice, and I think I loved it even more the second time around when I actually knew everything that was going to happen. But it's essentially the story of this very exclusive clique of old money college students studying at a liberal arts college in Vermont. They're studying the classics under the tutelage of their eccentric professor, to say the least. It's about the protagonist of the book, Richard, who is not old money, not new money, but no money, from California, really trying to make his way into the friend group. And he experiences this like weird mix of emotions surrounding them. He's like at once morbidly curious, he has such a desire to be accepted by them, and it's so fascinating just to like to see how much it says about human nature and how much we all want to be accepted, even by people who we probably should not want the approval of. And the catalyst of the novel is the murder of Bunny, one of the members of the clique. Alright, that's all for today. I really hope you pick up and enjoy at least one of these books, and I know there's so many that I've missed, so I will probably end up making a part 2 to this video. Let me know if you want one. And also, give me some recommendations. What are classic books that you think are really worth reading that I missed today? And also, don't forget to check out Pair using the link in my description or my discount code MeelaSims15 for 15% off your first order of your pair of glasses. That's all. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.